Hey everyone, welcome back to Mind Keys. Have you ever heard the term that there is no such thing as a bad trip? This is kind of a very common, very popular concept going around on the internet right now, kind of a reframe of negative psychedelic experiences that I think, to put it bluntly, is bullshit. I think is completely not accurate, not true, and really does people, in large, the public, the masses that are taking psychedelics, a major disservice by kind of gaslighting their experience a little bit by denying it doesn't exist. I know it's kind of a strong claim. So let me go ahead and unpack this a bit for you. My intention with this video is quite simple. I want you to know the difference between a bad trip versus a difficult trip, how to recognize the difference between the two, and also how to do your best to optimize avoiding both. Okay, let's go ahead and get into it here. And really quick, for anyone who's new to the channel, a warm hello and welcome to you. My name is Dave. I'm a coach. I'm a hypnotherapist. I love to talk about this kind of intersection of spirituality, personal awakening, personal transformation, personal development work, and psychedelics, and how they all kind of overlap and go together in different ways so that we can really use all the tools we have available to us to self-actualize, to grow, to transform. As well as just kind of generally, I like to foster the conversation of this kind of deep inquiry into what it means to grow, transform, heal, awaken as a human being, and kind of maximize the human experience. So if that's your bag, that's your kind of thing, you're certainly in the right place. I'm honored to have you aboard for the conversation. And thank you so much for your time and your attention today. Before I sign off and we get into the content here, I just want to acknowledge also really quick, it's very noisy in my surroundings. I'll be doing my best to try to clean up the audio after the effect. But if you hear, wind coming from outside, if you hear my crock pot rattling in the background or anything like that, please forgive me. I'm doing the best I can with the limited means I have here at home. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and get into the main content of the video. Okay, so you might think that what I just said is a little bit scandalous. I mean, if you are kind of current with the dialogue or the conversation as it's unfolding online and in social media in relationship to psychedelics and psychedelic therapy, surely you will have heard this term or this phrase rather, that there is no such thing as a bad trip, just that there are kind of difficult trips. Now, I had subscribed to this belief for a little while, and my opinion, my view on this is that this is really a reframe from psychedelic therapists and people in the psychedelic research community to try to minimize the perception that psychedelics are dangerous or that psychedelics are bad or threatening to people and not worthy of investigation and not worthy of study, et cetera, et cetera. I think some of this is just a reactionary stance in relationship to the kind of let's call it cultural fallout from the 1960s, from Leary, from what happened with just the kind of the hippie revolution and the countercultural revolution, everything that happened from that. That's still a major imprint on society from that moment in history. And there's a lot of baggage, a lot of cultural baggage, a lot of judgment, a lot of, preconceptions and stigmas that the psychedelic community still has to get over because of that. So I can really admire and acknowledge how there's a positive intention here on behalf of researchers to try to minimize that and reframe that, as well as to create some, space for people to give themselves permission to have potentially a difficult time with psychedelics without really classifying it as bad. So I think that there's a valid, kernel of truth here, but I also think it's not the whole truth. And I think it's ultimately kind of a bullshitty, unkind, unfair thing to do, because there are clearly millions of people out there who have had genuinely terrible experiences with psychedelics. Bad trips do exist. I've had them. And so I want to give you some nuance here so that you know the difference between the two, so we can really clearly identify what's what. And then we'll wrap with kind of a basic harm reduction, where I just kind of explain how to avoid all of this altogether so that you can really optimize to have the best experience possible. So let's talk about the difference between a difficult trip and a bad trip. I'll give you a little bit of my own story here, and then we'll just wrap with a little bit of information on how to avoid all this. So first things first here, let's talk about difficult trips. So there is a difference between a difficult trip and a bad trip. And I do think that this phrase that there's no such thing as bad trips, kind of points towards this implicit understanding that some of the experiences you'll have on psychedelics will just be difficult. They'll be challenging. They might be upsetting, like you might see something you'd forgotten and totally repressed and it comes back up to the surface. You may see something you don't want to acknowledge about yourself or about life or about people you love around you. You might get some sort of insight into the nature of humanity or, where we're at in our world that's rather upsetting and causes grief for you. You might just generally have an experience of negative emotions well up for no clear reason, right? You may have overwhelm. You may have a sudden, pang of fear, which might actually just be your nervous system releasing some fear from somewhere earlier in your life that you kind of just held onto and stored in your nervous system, didn't realize that had happened. It's just kind of arising out of you for no apparent reason, kind of like an existential fear that isn't really attached to any particular event or moment or memory or trauma or anything like that. You might have really intense body sensations that are really uncomfortable, nausea, maybe even vomiting, or dizziness or disorientation or pressure in the body, cold sweats, things like this are super common on psychedelics. You may have what else? You may have, what other difficult experiences can arise? You may have, something challenging happen in your environment while you're really high and really impressionable. Someone says something that, is very upsetting to you or comes across as rude or invalidating. You might have someone break up with you, like while you're on psychedelics, or you might get a phone call with some bad news. These kinds of things do happen. Difficult emotions, overwhelm, grief, sadness, anger, frightening, upsetting memories, upsetting truths, unsettling truths. You might even just be confronted with the kind of a weird sense of like nihilism or meaninglessness in life that gives you a sense of complete ungroundedness. All of these are very normal and not what I would consider a bad trip. So in my mind, all of these are difficult but valid experiences to have. They are all just part of the human experience. If we're going to be honest, some days are bad days. Sometimes we get bad news. Sometimes we have negative emotions. Sometimes we remember things we don't want to remember. Sometimes we understand something we'd rather not see about ourselves or life around us. These are all very important pieces of the human experience. And just because you're high on a psychedelic doesn't mean that you get to avoid these types of experiences. And it doesn't mean that you should. And a lot of times when they come up, the invitation there really is to go deeper with your own human experience and develop the resilience and the capacity and the internal wisdom and the strength and the open-mindedness and the open-heartedness to look at this stuff, to engage with it, to learn from it, to evaluate it, maybe to unpack it and really think about it. And, maybe spend your whole trip kind of unpacking something that you'd rather not think about. For an example, one that comes to mind right now, I've had so many, I'm sure I've said many times on the channel, but just in case you're a new viewer, I've had over 800, full dose trips in my life. So I've had plenty of experiences along the way of, moments that were difficult, maybe in an otherwise great trip, or moments or whole trips that were just kind of difficult and uncomfortable, or maybe upsetting, a little bit of a bummer, a little bit deep, a little bit melancholy, just as part of processing my own human experience. Like I was just about to say, I can remember, I think it was my second time ever taking psychedelics. My first girlfriend ever, my first love, broke up with me. And I was really sad and I was really bummed out. Obviously, your first breakup is always kind of a moment in your life. It's really kind of a unique, new thing that, most of us have never gone through before. And this was happening for me. And I decided to take LSD at a concert with some friends. Happened to be a death metal show at that. So that's kind of a funny example of probably not the best setting. But so my set wasn't great. I was sad because I was breaking with a girlfriend. I was in a concert with a bunch of like heavy, dark, weird music. And yet I spent the whole kind of time just, introspecting on my experience of the relationship, of the breakup, how I felt about it, and ended up really getting over it and grieving it and letting it go. And by the end of the night, I was at peace with it. I was fine. I'd actually let go because I was willing to move into the emotions and feel them and just kind of, sift through what it meant to me and what I learned from it and how I felt about it and who I would be moving forward and all that kind of stuff. So difficult trips can be very productive. They can be very informative. They can, be very valuable even. And they are just, I think, to be expected in the whole spectrum of emotional and just kind of life experiences that we can have. Sometimes we have difficult moments in life, and that's true whether you're high or not. So that's kind of what I would consider a difficult trip. Anything sad, upsetting, challenging, overwhelming, that kind of a thing, right? So let's go ahead and talk a bit about how a bad trip contrasts to a difficult trip like that, now that you have a sense of what a difficult trip might entail, okay? So by contrast, what then is a bad trip exactly? Well, I think there's a line where it goes from difficult to genuinely bad. Now, I've had, like I said, I've done over 800, macrodose experiences. I've had plenty of difficult experiences within that, or moments that were difficult. Out of all of those, I would say I've had 2 actual bad trips. So that's a pretty good ratio. 2 out of over 800 is batting pretty great. And in my case, both those bad trips were early on. They were both probably within the first 100 trips that I'd taken. Now, for me, this is how I would define a bad trip. Now, this is, again, something that is subjective, and one could argue that there's no such thing as a bad trip, or one could argue that anything negative is a bad trip, which I think is kind of being overly sensitive about it. But here's where I draw the line and say, okay, that's a bad trip. If you get to a place where you have completely lost control of yourself, where you have completely lost control of your physical body and functions, where you are not present at all in your mind, like your brain is switched off and you're not thinking, and you're generally in a panic mode, an anxiety mode, a pure reactivity kind of animal reaction mode. That's kind of what I would consider a bad trip. So, generally speaking, to make this even more clear, there's a line where people go from overwhelmed and uncomfortable and, finding it maybe stressful and upsetting, where something kind of clicks for the person and their brain shuts off and their inputs and their senses aren't working at all. And it creates the effect of a panic attack while being very high on a psychedelic. Now, you can be very high and overwhelmed and frightened and not have a panic attack. And again, I would not call that a bad trip. I would just call that difficult. But once it crosses over into panic attack land, where your brain shuts off, you are just in pure fight or flight. You might, run around and do crazy things. You might attack people. You might say all kinds of things you wouldn't normally say or don't really mean. Or you might just generally fall into complete and total anxiety and overwhelm, where you can't deal, where you're completely stressed, where you're terrified to the fucking core in a way that maybe you haven't ever experienced before. That's what I would consider a bad trip. Now, like I said, I've only had a couple of these. And that first bad trip of mine really left a huge imprint on me. It left a huge mark. Now, eventually it got better, but during that experience, I was just completely overwhelmed, overloaded, terrified. My mind was in panic mode, and there was nothing I could do to switch that off or turn that off or soothe myself or cause it to not be in panic mode. And it wasn't just that I was maybe having bad, dark, weird visions, because those happen too with psychedelics. It wasn't just that I was upset and it was a bit much. It was that it was over the line, and it was my first panic attack. I was probably 17 at the time, and I've not had a panic attack up to that point in my life. So I had no reference experience for what a panic attack was. Then my first one happened while I was very, very high on a psychedelic. That to me is a bad trip. Now, since then, I've gone to a lot of concerts. I was, kind of a jam band hippie for a long time, and a lot of raves and festivals and these kind of places where people get very high on psychedelics. And I've seen a number of people have these kinds of meltdown, blowout, pure terror, pure overwhelm, not functioning. The person is not in their rational, logical, executive function brain at all mode. I've seen a bunch of these types of experiences happen, and it's a sight to see. It's a very sad thing to see happen to people, because it's just so clear that they're in absolute overwhelm and absolute terror. Now, when we get to that kind of a place, so, some people out there may still hold the line because they subscribe to this kind of psychology reframe that, there's no such thing as bad trips, and they'll hold the line saying that this is still an important, valuable experience. I disagree. What I've seen when I've talked to people, I've had these experiences afterwards, what I've seen from my own experiences is that when you hit this kind of a place, there's nothing really useful that comes out of that kind of experience. There's no real learning that comes out of it usually. There's no wisdom. There's no peace afterwards, except just gratitude for being back to normal, more or less. There is no, there's no cosmic wisdom or positive insights or downloads. In fact, a lot of times, if you're getting messages at all, they're so fucking scrambled and all over the place that it's more like being, I don't know what being schizophrenic was like, so let me put that aside, and that's not necessarily true, but it's more like just getting the most scrambled, jumbled messages possible that have no use or utility or value for your life. So those do exist. Those are real. And I just want to, add voice to that and say, it's unlikely that you'll end up there, especially if you're preparing properly. If you're dialing in your set and setting, which we'll talk about more in just a moment. If you are generally, not overdosing, not taking too much and being, crazy about your dosage. If you are generally, making sure you have, countermeasures in place, whether those are things to help you come down if you need it, or people you can call to trip sit you through it, or anything like that. The more you stack the deck in your favor, the less of a chance this is going to happen to you. But, it can happen. And I just want to put this message out there that bad trips are real. They do exist. It's like a panic attack while you're way too high to even be able to function, which is kind of the worst of all possible scenarios. Generally, nothing good comes out of it. And it's a totally different thing from just being sad, bummed out, angry, grieving, overwhelmed, a little too deep, a little too serious, or anything like that. So there's definitely such a thing as a bad trip, and it's not the same thing as a challenging trip. Okay, so let's talk a bit about how to avoid this, and do optimize against this so that you know what to do, and we'll just kind of end it there. Okay, so let's just talk for a moment about how you can avoid bad and difficult trips to the best of your ability. I kind of just gave it away at the end of the last section here, but just to summarize here. So for anyone who's new to the channel, maybe you haven't seen any of my other videos before, I have two videos that kind of touch upon this. One would be set and setting, which I'll put a card up for here. And then there's also going to be another video, which is understanding the importance of surrendering, which I'll put a card up for here. So these are two of the most important things you can three really of the most important things you can understand in terms of safety and harm reduction when it comes to psychedelics. Number one, your set is your set. Well, we're going to say 1 and 2 are set and settings. So number one is your set. So your set is your mindset. It is the set of beliefs you are bringing to the experience. It's the set of expectations you have. It is the the optimism that may be ungrounded. It is the pessimism. It is the the dark beliefs that life is terrible and you're fucked, and whatever set of beliefs you're bringing to the experience are going to color and shape the experience you have in a deep, profound way. This is something I'll be talking about a lot more because I'm starting to recognize that one of my jobs as a coach here is to help people really create a good narrative, a good set that sets them up for success with psychedelics. And this is something that's sorely lacking in the modern conversation. But you want to basically make sure you're in a good mindset, that you're open-minded, that you're optimistic, that you understand that it can be very intense, that you're prepared for that intensity, right? Then there's setting. This is also very, very, very key to get about taking psychedelics successfully. You want to make sure that you are setting as your surroundings. It's whatever's around you, because psychedelics make you very impressionable to everything around you. It means that every little thing, every little person, every little comment, every little sight, scent, smell, sound, the environment you're in impacts how you feel in a much more dramatic way. So you want to understand this and control for it. That means you want to have a safe environment surrounded with beautiful things. You want it to smell nice. You want it to be well organized and clean. You want to, have food and water close by so that it's easy to get when you need it. You want to have, friends that you can call if you get a little bit overwhelmed and you need a trip sitter, or are there with you to hold space with you. You want to have, music that's right, that's not too intense or too weird or too upsetting, that's not conveying a really dark, upsetting emotion. You want your setting to be nice and dialed in so that you feel comfortable, so that you feel safe, so that you feel relaxed, so that you feel good, so that you feel positive. This is really important because setting goes, and also, I almost overlooked this. This is important. With setting, people are probably the biggest factor. If you are around people who you don't like, or who don't like you, or you have beef with, or tension with, or awkwardness with, where there's judgment, you will key in on that when you get really high. So you want to make sure that all of that is easy peasy, totally smooth, totally cool. You like everyone around you. You like your environment, sights, sounds, smells, all of that is dialed in. That's super key. So that's setting. Then the third thing is surrender. You want to know how to let go into the experience. Now, this is something that is harder to teach someone who's never taken a psychedelic before. So if you're brand new, this might be a bit more of a thing to try to understand. But the basic idea is that as the sensations in your body and the energy that's moving through you, and the the new thoughts arising through you are opening up, and you're having new experiences, you want to open yourself and completely let go into that, right? So if you feel like you're just going to evaporate into like scattered atoms in the wind, then maybe what you want to do is lay down and let yourself become the atoms that are scattered in the wind. You don't want to fight it. If you feel like you've lost your mind and you've forgotten who you are, you want to go with that and just allow yourself to lose your mind and forget who you are for a little while. If you are feeling, again, like some sadness is welling up, you want to surrender to the sadness and allow it to arise and show you and teach you and inform you. This helps to, really insulate you from having a bad experience. This is one of the major keys to successfully doing psychedelics safely and well. So setting, surrender. Excuse me, the links to the video will be above and also down below so that you can watch the other videos about this. So that's really it. In summary, I don't buy the belief that there's no such thing as a bad trip, because I know firsthand that there is such a thing as a bad trip. I know that there's a difference between difficult trips and bad trips, and hopefully you now understand this as well. You get it, and you are able to know and expect and reasonably make space for in your psychedelic experiences that there will be sadness, there will be anger, there will be upsetting memories, there will be moments of overwhelm, there will be confusion, there will be all kinds, awkwardness and discomfort and all kinds of less than ideal experiences, along with all the bliss and the joy and the laughter and the wisdom and the insight and the healing and the forgiveness and the breakthroughs and the creativity and all the wonderful things that come with psychedelics too. It's a whole rainbow. It's a whole spectrum of experience. And so we can't ignore and exclude the negative side of that spectrum, or the unpleasing side of that spectrum, because often that's where a lot of the lessons, a lot of the wisdom, a lot of the healing, a lot of the truth is. So it's valuable, but that is a different thing entirely from having an overloading, overwhelming panic attack that renders you completely overwhelmed, completely useless, and in complete terror for hours and hours and hours upon end. So now that you know the difference, I hope that this information is protective and useful for you, and helps you to know the difference, to recognize what's what, and to steer clear of any truly bad experiences to the best of your ability. So anyways, with that, I'm going to wrap. I hope you guys have a beautiful day. Thanks for watching. And if you like this video, do consider subscribing to the channel, clicking the like down below, just to help the YouTube algorithm get this message out to more people, and support the channel. I've got more content on the way shortly. Thanks.